Okay, onward to part two in this. I already sent or uploaded part one and then came back and checked it to make sure, and sure enough, it cut off the last part of my speech where I was telling you that we're going to keep it on this picture here, but let's go to part two. It's in your upper left hand corner, and I'll see you there. Somehow it wants to cut that 20 seconds off. Irregardless, here again we have a double rainbow that's going over Noah's Ark and all the animals that go along with this, and then the people here. And strangely, we've gotten to talking, instead of about Sumeria or even the people in the Holy Land, people that ended up taking over the Holy Land during a large portion of the part. It's not during the time that they're even talking about, but ended up being much later. More about the time whenever the Bible was actually written. And so we're talking about the Hurrians now and their connections, but they're also one of the people that have the earliest Proto-Indo-European dialect and most direct to that. The next closest would probably be the Trocharian people, who are in ancient China. There's ones that you've seen in my other videos that have the mummies that are connected to a lot of pyramids that are not talked about in China and so on like that. Let's just continue here. So Hurry of the Hurrians would be the Iranian pronunciation of the same name as the Iranian name of the sun god, Havare, suggest an entire Hurrian ethnos that may have been characterized by sun worship. I've described how everybody's religion here in the Caucasian people is derived from sun worship, has gone through an incredible amount of pantheons and so on situation, and then if you'll look at it, we're back to sun worship with Jesus Christ himself. This isn't about connecting Jesus to sun worship, but he was the one that, with the Bible that is put out there, makes the connection back. It's actually what that's all about. Let's continue. It's possible that the Proto-Hurrians or Proto-Dravidians, which you'd be talking about the Aryan types, typified the original Noachidian family. Strange that Hurrian people, he would point that out. It cannot be forgotten that the Japethic or Aryan branch was early related to the same Noachidian family. Well, let's just say this straightforward. If they were part of that family was. It's that simple. It's not some game where, hey, these two people magically had 3 different subtypes out of their children, poppity-boo. It doesn't work that way exactly. Then again, if you want to work with the way it came out exactly, there was interbreeding with some of these people that were variations of Caucasians, and that's pretty much the demographics that we see today. Gordon Child's conjecture regarding the Mediterranean aspect of the earliest populations of the large region between West Asia and Central Europe seems to be confirmed archaeologically by the fact that the graves of the Aryan culture of the Bishkent, about 1700, 1500 BC, related to the northern Bactro-Margiana archaeological complex, what we call BIMAC, has also yielded mostly Mediterranean skeletons. But the fact that it was mostly Mediterranean and then the nobility are showing to be something slightly different is quite telling. And in fact, in all of these occasions it is. If we go a little bit north of that BIMAC complex, you'll see what that integration is in the people that are right there below it, and then we just hoppy skip right over them and we're in India, or the northern reaches of it, in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and now we're back in that Elam situation. And didn't we say something about them coming from the east? So the youngest branch of the Noachidian race, the Hamites, are stated in the biblical table of nations to be the actual founders of Sumerian and Egyptian cultures, since Cush, Sumer, and Mizraim, Egypt, are the sons of Ham. So this would have been the same people, and there's no variation and nothing. Be like, well, it could have been. No, no. It's the same situation. One can easily clarify this by looking at the nobility of Egypt during its beginning, the Sumerians during its beginning, and the gods of each, and the way they portrayed them in the beginning. If you simply look up blue-eyed Egyptians, you'll see all these crystal blue-eyed statues that are made, and even scribes and so on, but that comes from nobility. That's our people that weren't the prince that got to be the king, that went on, and their family and their families and so on, because that's the ones that take over for other dynasties, and it works its way in. If you're looking at that blue-eyed Egyptians, you can look at blue-eyed Sumerians, and I'll show you a lot of statues, and probably one of the pictures that's going to show up, and I told you I was going to go and do this, but I don't want to ruin it, go back and forth here. You'll see that they're all inlaid with this blue eyes, and that they found some 53 statues, and they have them in a collection, and they're all different heights from about 2.5 foot, or just below that, all the way down to about 6 or 7 inches. And all of this is the pantheons and sub-gods and subs of the Sumerian gods, and they all have inlaid lapis lazuli blue eyes. In fact, if we look at the proto-dynastic Egyptians, you'll see the Nakata series also has inlaid blue eyes into that, and in golden statues. We'll take a look at that once we get totally through this situation here. This is a multi-parter as we're doing it. It's going to take a couple for it to do each one. So we will show that to you coming up. So it's the youngest race would have been this Hamites, supposedly, out of the groups. Keep that in thought too, along with all the other things that I talked about before. So here we talk about the curse and the influence of the curse of the Tower of Babel. According to Genesis 11:19, the Semites, Hamites, and Japethites that were located in the east, perhaps Elam, like the Bible said, so they were in the east, were split into different branches, speaking different languages following the curse of Babel. So it's likely that the languages of the early Mesopotamian Ubaid culture, or circa 6500 BC down to 3800, of Elam and Eridu, as well as the earliest Uruk, 4000 to 3200 BC, and the Semitic Proto-Akkadian Kish at 3100 BC was a common Noachidian one. Perhaps a form of agglutinative Proto-Davidian Proto-Hurrian, whereas the languages of the Akkadian period, 2300 BC, were already split into an afflected Akkadian or agglutinative Sumerian and agglutinative Elamite and afflected Aryan languages. I always looked at it a slightly different way. The reason that you see a variation on Sumerian languages and then saying a Hamitic type languages was as these people came in to help form the civilization that was going on of what was going on there already. In a couple of these cases, they adopted the other people's languages and developed it from there. In the other forms, and well, I guess you could say in all other forms. So after trying that a couple of times, maybe it was best in the next wave for it to go all hooked up, so you get the Proto-Indo-European linguistics that go from Sanskrit to Irish. And people have shown this connection to where it works from a long time ago. And then, of course, if we connect its wings back to the body of where it started from, now we're right above the Caucasus Mountains, in that area around the Black Sea, which interestingly they also all try to agree now that about 10,000 years ago, or at the end of the last ice age, everybody's hooked up that has blue eyes now is related to a people that came out of that area with blue eyes, and it's supposed to have worked its way down. So again, whenever we look at that Egyptian blue-eyed people and so on, you can see it there. But then how many other people did these people help? Well, you can look at other statues of Buddha and such all the way through India and Thailand that still contain blue eyes in them. In fact, one of the key points to actually becoming a righteous man in the Buddhist tradition here. Number 22, I believe it is blue eyes. For some reason, it just throws that in there. Like that might be somewhat needed. Let's continue. So here we see that Tower of Babel, and not to go off, because believe me, I could babble about this all day too in itself. The Tower of Babel was actually one of the ziggurats being built in one of the Sumerian cities, and it got 3/4 built. There was a great rain. It caused a flood, but it wasn't the one we're all talking about. Everything, it just a little flood, but it caused the middle part of it, kind of looks like it here, to cave in somewhat, because this was one of the last ones they tried to do this, but the center part of it was just done with sun-dried bricks, which actually will melt back eventually, if not protected. And then on the outside of it, they put bitumen-covered, fired-killed bricks, and if that all sealed real good, that would have been okay, but because they didn't have the thing built to a point that they could stand a rain to it, it caused some ruining to the inside of it, and it never got completed. And so as people came much later, with a different people controlling the area in the time, and a large demographic change, asked them about what the hell goes on, and stories came from that, and ideals, but was it so much taller than any other ziggurat before? And oh my God, no. No, it was just a ziggurat. They get real tall. Well, you get to a certain height, and then God gets mad. He goes, oh, you're getting close to my sun, or to my sky castle that's floating around the clouds here somehow. You know, there's a mountain there in the right of that picture that's a little taller than this, so you can just go up on that mountain. If this is a problem, you go up on the mountain, and oh, what does he do? Does lightning kill you if you tried to get closer to God? The whole story that goes around that doesn't make much sense. In fact, it's the idea of the reason why some of this doesn't make much sense is in this story right here. While people are confused and have different languages and so on. Here, cut through open a third wall, I guess, again, or maybe a fourth. Hell, I live with it wide open door anyhow. Look over here. Yeah, there, I'm talking now. So, if there ever was a language that we can go back from all these people that we're talking about in an area, even though it has to do with Sumerians, and that's not the language that really connects to all of these other people, the language that would be Aryan. But I've also talked about how if you really truly want to talk to them and other people that aren't even really mentioned in this, that one easy way to be able to do it is with mathematics. And we talked about that in the sacred geometry videos. Because 7 is 7. 5 is 5. But you have to understand mathematics to be able to get to big numbers. You notice how the people of India and China are able to do that? Let's continue. The association with Babel, where the different branches of the original Noachidian family split supposedly into separate cultures, it is the Hamitic king Nimrod, the son of Cush. It's difficult to identify Nimrod with any one ruler actually of Mesopotamia, but Levin, for example, suggests that he is a recollection of the famous Eastern Semitic ruler Sargon of Akkad. And a lot of people connect onto that, and other people say, well, you know, it's really it's a conglomerate of a few people and all thrown into one. But if we're talking about the Bible and things here, that was the guy that said that he was put in a basket of rushes and set free, and because you couldn't have been a concubine from the other people's daughter and stuff, so he was a half-breed of a... Oh, what? Yeah, that's kind of like the idea in the Moses idea, where he's just floated downstream and then picked up by nobility of Egypt somehow, and then raised, and then he does this backlash against them and let my people go, right? So that's a whole other series of videos, believe me. So Sargon of Akkad, 2300 BC, who's also called himself the king of Kish, which represents the biblical Cush. And this is where we get that name and that concept. So when we're talking later about a people that are actually up over Egypt that have a very similar name, it has connectives to these people. In Pseudo-Philo's Liber Antiquarium Biblicarium, or Biblical Antiquities book, in the 1st century AD, besides the Tower of Babel, was constructed not just by Nimrod, ruler of the Hamites, but also by Joktan. That's one of those people that was on that list we were just looking at there. He's prince of the Semites, and Fennec, which has to do with Phoenicians, as ruler of the Japethites. What? Seeley considers the date of the building of the tower to have been around 3500 to 2400 BC, though it may have been later than the first settlement of Kish, which was around 3100 BC. Well, the first settlement in the Bible, what it tells you is, was there, but whenever you look at it in the Sumerian tales, they tell you that the first, and when heaven came down to earth and they decided to make the cities, the first one was in Eridu, and Eridu's way out down near the delta. But the Sumerians that we talk about stretch all the way up to Nippur and all the way down through it, which is leading all the way up into these same lands. The Tigris and Euphrates, where Eden happened in between, the Sumerians called their fertile land that they grew their gardens in Eden. Isn't it strange how that book starts in a garden, when we know now that before people were making gardens, right? But that's not looking here. There was a new beginning. There's more to way to look at that moment that it shows in there because of a great flood that everybody's familiar with, right? So if you look at these people, they're supposedly building the Tower of Babel, and that doesn't that because it's drawn in more of a medieval times, and the people there are not even really familiar with the building style of a ziggurat, are pulling off this thing right here that looks like just a going up tower, like the Tower of Lebanon, or like towers that are used in castles and stuff. And if you look, every one of these guys is blonde. Gold foil background. The dating of the Tower of Babel is significant because although the vast majority of the people of the Mesopotamia region seem to have been of the Mediterranean type, there's a noticeable difference in the Uruk culture of Sumer, which is around 3500 BC, as well as in early Egypt. Noting that, well, what was the noticeable difference? Well, they're blue-eyed people. So as well as in early Egypt, between an early stratum of Mediterranean folk and later Brachiocelid or Armenoid type one, a major difference is that it's evident between the Ubaid and Uruk cultures that there's respective customs of interment, with the former favoring an extended posture of the corpse and the later a flexed version of the corpse, laid on its left, usually facing to the east or the west, while the skulls found in the graves of the Ubaid period are all dialocephalate and Mediterranean. Those of the subsequent Uruk culture that comes in are mixed, showing at first a predominance of brachiocephaly, which is gradually replaced by dialocephaly. The new race thus seems to have been fully assimilated into the older population. I've talked before about how when people come together and I've got peanut butter and you've got chocolate, how sometimes you can make something that's better than the both, especially if one set of that group there is real abilitized in such things. So again, I don't know why they choose this, but here we go with an Armenoid type man, and they show you this, and just due to that mustache, the sloping of the face there, you can almost feel the accents that's going to come out of this guy. But so one of Egypt they talk about. The brachiocephalate skulls of Uruk are similar to those found in early dynastic Egypt regarding the oldest Egyptian civilization, which we may characterize as Hamitic, following the Bible and Malalas. It is chiefly characterized by the pottery of an area found around the Badari, which is Badarians, and Wadi Hammermat. Petrie himself identified the group around Wadi Hammermat as Punites, or the people who came from the land of Punt and worshipped men of Coptos. Wilkinson, however, has recently claimed that the petroglyphs from the Badarian period, which is 5000 to 4000 BC, well predating Egypt, suggest that the origin of the Egyptian civilization is to be found in the eastern desert itself. Wilkinson maintains that the people who made the petroglyphs were indigenous Badarians, since their boat drawings are earlier than those of the Mesopotamians, whom Winkler had considered as the source of this hypothetical group of eastern invaders. I say, why does it have to be either whenever it actually is both? I showed this in a Egyptian origins video, and how a couple of people have put it all together, and all these cave drawings and drawings on the sides of walls of ships coming in with that bent up prow, and even on some of the death and burial sites that they have a plastered wall with art in it that actually is showing you these people that are leading to the founding of ancient Egypt. The one famous mummy that we have to go with this is Ginger, and he's an ancient Caucasian mummy with blondish hair, curly somewhat. They've got him in the British Museum now, but he was naturally mummified. And it is, people have said that from that situation and they're naturally mummifying their body, they tried to do it irnaturally, understanding the way natron works with animals when they really run into ones that had died on natron, and started the taxiderming of people, which we know as mummification, and then wrapping them all up, which a lot of that led to something like a cocoon effect, like a butterfly. He goes on, however, even though the Badarians may have been long settled in Egypt, it's possible that the Badarians themselves were not originally native to Egypt, since the rippling evidence in their ceramic decorations also bears a resemblance to that of the Palestinians. This Badarian or Punnite race may thus have been a Hamitic branch of the Proto-Davidian or even a Hurrian race, or he tries to put Proto-Davidian Hurrian race together, which you can't do that necessarily unless you're trying to talk about the Aryans of the Dravidian point, which first settled Elam, though the later was probably originally to Anatolia, and whence it spread to both Elam and Palestine. Well, the Palicet and Palestinian type people that we're looking at, again, we've shown that that is a European type people coming across the Mediterranean and settling in Egypt during that whole Bronze Age collapse and stuff, and from there. And of course, Palestine is real famous for having conflict with the Bible, and they had a giant with them and everything else. You can look at this fine-made bowl that's here. You can see the swirls and scratches that are in it, but almost in the center of that, there's a swirl that looks like this thing was done on a potter's wheel. And you look at the thin amounts and the way this is done, this looks as good as the Corelware we've got in the kitchen, but it's all blackened and red in the way that they cooked it somewhat, but high quality pottery nonetheless. And so this is Pottery Bowl, early dynastic Badarian, 5th millennium BC from El Badari. In addition to the regular black top interior, this bowl has the characteristic faint groove pattern of Badarian period on its surfaces. So they had that little groove set into them, and people kind of seen that. But better than that, there are other things that are not even made out of just clay and spun out that way. There are other artifacts that are going back from this time here that are showing that these people could do stonework in Dalmatian type granites and make something that looked just as good as that, just as thin as that, that of course is requiring a whole lot cooler tools than somebody beating on something with a rock, or even a copper chisel, or even a copper chisel hardened with arsenic and such, or even a bronze chisel. In fact, it's extremely difficult to do it if you take meteoric iron, if you want to put that into the situation that nobody wants to touch. And it would require a lathe. There's so many bowls and urns and stuff, and I call it one of the biggest parts of the world. Is like, here we go, that popcorn situation out of nowhere. These people are all making this stuff. Well, apparently they kept it. This is from the legacy situation from before, and they had been doing this for a long time and not leaving it around. And it's not part of burials. It gets kept because there were these people that don't leave much waste where they go around. Their little carbon footprint back then was like an elf, and you didn't even know they really existed. Short of symbols and things like that we have to connect it off of, they didn't leave much of a signature behind. And of course, whenever we look at things that are made out of scrolls and hide and perhaps even on wood, all of that would have rotted away long, long ago. You look at the Dead Sea Scrolls and how they were just really almost falling apart. And that was from the time of Christ. Give it about 2,000 more years, and that would have been primordially dust. Give it one good rainstorm that actually got to it, or even a humid period of a couple of weeks, and that would have been a mush of dust. Long, long ago. Nevertheless, both in the case of pre-dynastic Egyptians Naqada Edgar in Giza, in the case of Naqada New Race graves were shown G. Smith and Flinders Petrie, respectively, pointed to the evidential intrusive of an Armenoid type race that should be distinguished from the original founders of Egyptian civilization. Smith noticed the difference between the indigenous dilocephalic variety of the alien brachiocephalic, both type at Naqada El Dir, near Abydos and Giza in the Delta, that is, both in the upper and lower Egypt. This new race is also called the Dynastic race, which may have been characteristically brachiocephalic, big-boned and light-skinned, whereas the Mediterraneans are more dilocephalic, small-boned and brown. And by brown, they just mean a little bit more olive-skinned and like the Mediterranean people we see today. They are in all probability identifiable with the Armenoid or Alpine branch of the Indo-Europeans related to the biblical Japeth. Let's go over that again. The last statement right here is that that dynastic race would have not been the Mediterranean type with the dilocephalic head, which are more small-boned and brown, but they're probably identifiable with the Armenoid Alpine range of the Indo-Europeans rated to that biblical Japeth. Surely the nobility was. This is a supposed showing of the races that's all been redrawn here. Here we have Libyans, and you can see they're drawn somewhat pale, but then the nobility could keep themselves pale even in that situation if they wanted to. So some of these people that are showing up are nobility and not nobility. And when they show slaves and stuff like that, that wouldn't be nobility, they're workers. But you can see that they're tattooed up all over their bodies. Funny we see that at the earliest Egyptians, that ginger, the pre-dynastic Egyptian I talked about a moment ago, has been shown through infrared photography to have tattoos all over him. Also, we can look at Utsi, the Iceman, who's been found, a mummy that's made naturally also, up in the Alps though, if y'all know Utsi, and he too had sacred little tattoos all over him that meant things and stuff. And strangely enough, that Utsi man, his mtDNA they got out of it was haplogroup K, And we just talked about recently how whenever they were testing the King Tut and his family and the head who was supposed to have been Akhenaten and all these things, they found out, yeah, that whatever head that they've got that's there, that is the father of King Tut. So that would be Akhenaten. And then they are R1b and mtDNA-K. And the grandparents that leading into that they have the blonde-haired mummies that we've showed in quite a few videos of Thuya and Yuya, are also mtDNA-K, but haplogroup G2, which is also showing ancient people living in the Anatolian area. But again, maybe that's the reason that during the Amarna period, the people also realized that they were brothers with them, and we kept calling them brothers and such. Just like Herodotus noted that these people that were living right here, it's not because they're curly haired and they're tan because they do farming and stuff. It's the fact that they have circumcision, and the way that they do their linens and certain rituals seem to go along with it. But that's for another thing here. So you can see here that they've shown Asiatic types, if you will. Semitic types people try to put on this due to the fringe that's on them. Here are Nubians, drawn as extremely dark. Here are the ancient Egyptians, drawn with red ochre, and that confuses some people. But whenever you look at the art, the females are drawn as pale as these Libyans are here, and the males are drawn pretty much like this, especially if they're in action. So red ochre males and pale females has been easily seen inside of everybody's art from around the Mediterranean. It's a common thing that they've used, and red ochre art goes all the way back to caveman times. It's one of the original two colors people started out with, the other one using soot for black. So you could literally draw them with the first easily primary colors, and red ochre also is an iron oxide used for sunblock. But red ochre males and pale females, you can look and find it in Mitanni art, and the Minoans used it, the Etruscans used it, and even Greeks. And we know, the Greeks were more like that Libyan up there, weren't they? Yeah, and so were the Egyptians actually. But when showing that you're in action, you're a worker, you're well tanned. And believe me, because of the variations here, they were able to thin down and thicken the colors wherever they wanted it to. They used colors and associations when they wanted to, the way they wanted to. This Armenoid type coming in that he hooks with the Japethic type people seems to have already in the 4th millennium BC entered the Nile Delta from Palestine, Syria, but as Petrie points out, the type is equally present in Libya and could have encountered or entered Egypt from the west as well. In fact, Petrie notices the family resemblances between the new race, as he calls them, and the Libyans and the Palestinians or Amorites, as well as the earliest inhabitants of the Mycenae and Cyprus and even central Italy. Well, people back then were doing a lot of skull investigations, and you could tell so much from skulls, and had it all figured out that they could say, well, this is a little different, this is slightly different, and then the shapes of them, looking down on them, looks radically different. And this isn't from boarding or weird things like that. This is actually the common shapes of heads as they grow, and this is one way to tell subgroups of Caucasians. But earlier we were talking about how the other man had said, well, a lot of these people from the Barbarians and stuff had apparently come from out here in Africa, in Central Africa, and whenever it all dried up, had pulled over into there, and you find that that's right too. So yes and yes, both of them seem to be correct with it. It wasn't just one, for there was multiple events here, but whenever we look at the people that used to live in the Green Sahara, when it was green, it was also Caucasians too, and they're hooked up with the ancient Berbers of North Africa. And so you can get that same consternation where maybe they came from the west of these people all up here around the Mediterranean and not from straight down the run from up there in Anatolia, because, well, it's kind of confusing. The whole area is covered with Caucasians. So it breaks down into an idea of looking at head types and bite patterns and dental patterns and things like that for people to start making assumptions. And believe me, looking at old papers, people made all kinds of assumptions off of one find as opposed to filling it all in together and looking at that as being one separate entity. Crete, in its Neolithic period, seemed to Sir Arthur Evans to be an insular offshoot of an extensive Anatolian province, the ancient island of Crete. The name of the legendary King Minos of Crete is cognate with Manu, or Menes, representing the first man, kind of like an Adam in Egypt here, and this may be due to their racial relation to the Armenoid Egyptians of the Delta and those to the further west in Libya in the period immediately following the Neolithic. Well, recently we talked about how Uruk got their name in Europa, and Europa married the father of that person that was the legendary King Minos that spawned forth King Minos itself. So if we're looking at it in that form, isn't that strange now? The arrival of the new race is dated by Petrie to be around 3200 BC, so predating dynastic Egypt by far. That is, at the time of the Uruk culture, the rise of which may have been dependent on the infusion of newcomers into a more indigenous Mesopotamian society. As in Mesopotamia, the arrival of the new race in Nakana coincides with the emergence of a greater complexity of social organization. The culture of the later dynastic Egyptians probably involved a fusion of the original Bedarian with this new race. Again, doubling up on these new things that come in, and then an idea. Rather than y'all running it all down there in the Delta and all this, let's get together. Now there's a war, and then it comes together. It stays together quite a bit, falls apart a few times through its fruition, but because it didn't get taken over by the Akkadians here shortly, like what happens here, well, it did much later, but it has the longest dynastic stretch. And so people herald it and go after it crazy. And of course, because of the biblical connections to Sumer, I think that's why it gets neglected more often than not. It seems like from the first finding of things like, hey, here's the Noah story, they went, oh, shut that door real quick. And it's taken generations to get to the point where people are willing to even look at this and have more of an open mind. Just a few generations ago, things like this, oh, you're a witch, so it really. So he's telling you that this Egyptian culture probably involved an infusion. It probably involves Mesopotamian people coming into it of the Fertile Crescent. And of course, we realize that it did, even in its inception in the first place, where already at this point they had had cattle for a long time, and those cattle come from the same source that the Sumerian cattle come from these people up around the Fertile Crescent that we know of as Japethites, or Scythian type people, who are the people that brought us the wheel and horses and so on, in different waves as it came down through, even into Egypt, which we know of as the Hyksos period, whenever they acquired these new chariots, which helped him go on. And so you look at this is an ancient Sumerian relief from way back when. This is earliest dynasties. You can tell from the look, and look how he has the marking and extra eye makeup around his eye that's going on there, and holding these urns. Man depicted on Uruk vase, Pergamon Museum. Although the Smith-Petrie theory of the new race has been discounted by contemporary historians, it has been revived recently by a couple of British historians such as David Roll and Michael Price, and it is quite possible that the Hamitic founders of Egyptian dynastic culture in Sumer may have benefited from an interaction, at least, with a rather different race that has been called the new race or dynastic race. For a clear identification of this new race, we may have to return to the Beaker folk, who appeared throughout Europe and North Africa in the 3rd millennium BC. So now we're about to go on to part 3, and it'll be in your top left hand corner. But since I have a few minutes left in the 45-minute period on this video, I think we'll go to some of those pictures I talked about at the end of the last video and the start of this one here. But keep in mind, we're talking about the Bell Beaker folk that I had also talked about recently and their connections. But there's a split off of those that didn't just go west into above the Mediterranean, but down and into it. It's an earlier stretch of it, though. We know them as the Nakata people, and there's a variant that comes in over the top of that of the Barrel Beaker folk. Yeah, and you can see that in the pottery that changes there. Even Petrie and others have noticed this long time before. So let's see if we can get this thing to react right. And can I? Wow, I'm locked up. I'm on this page and locked up. Oh, I'm trapped. We're starting part 3 with the pictures I was telling you about, and we'll go on to its part 2 here. So it'll continue on for a few more. This will be released as a series back to back, and everything will be in your top left hand corner for each successive part. Leave a comment down below, and we'll see you there. Peace.